Good morning. Go ahead and do our sign-ins while we're waiting for more people to log in. All right, so we'll get started here in a minute. Just a couple of reminders for you guys. We have the last essay due tonight. So hopefully you're not waiting until the last minute to get that started, but better to wait till the last minute than not do it at all. So I look forward to looking at those and getting those graded. Also, you guys have one more quiz coming up due on, I think it's the 30th. Yep. Which is a week from today. So next Thursday, your last quiz is due. And I also want to reiterate that there's a chance that we could possibly run out of time. There's a chance that we could possibly run out of time before I'm able to get all of chapter 15 covered. And if that happens, I will just record an extra lecture and post it for you guys. It won't be a live lecture, but I'll just post it as an addendum, and that's how I'll handle that if it comes to that. Okay. So I think that's all I have for you guys in terms of announcements. Like I said, please do sign in if you haven't already. Today we're going to continue in chapter 14. Last time we were discussing obsessive compulsive disorder when we left off, and we watched a video about Howie Mandel, the famous comedian and game show host who is probably one of the most famous people these days who suffer from OCD. And that was kind of informative to look at. Today we're going to start by finishing up the anxiety disorders. We have one more to talk about, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also adjustment disorders, which is kind of like PTSD light, to oversimplify a little bit. So let's go ahead and get the slides pulled up here. Give me a second to do that. There we go. All right, you guys should have a full screen view of the chapter 14 slides. And we will continue now with a brief exploration of the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder, and I have a video that I'm going to show you guys on that topic as well. PTSD is a relatively well-known mental illness. Given that Pensacola State College is a military-friendly school, and in fact, we are a highly ranked military-friendly school in a military town, Pensacola. We get a lot of veterans at Pensacola State College. No worries, Kayla, it happens. We get a lot of veterans at Pensacola State, and a lot of veterans who have seen combat. And I wouldn't be surprised. Just a quick little survey in the comments. If you are a veteran or have spent time in the military, give me a yes in the chat. I'm just curious how many veterans or former service members we have in the class. And we have Gene was in the military. Anybody else? Well, I think those of you who have served for your service, I mean that sincerely. I know a lot of people say that, and it kind of is a cliche that people say, but I really mean it. And teaching at a military friendly institution, I've had a number of students over the years who have opened up to me and to classmates. Jordan's father was to classmates about having experience with PTSD, suffering from PTSD. And not every veteran has PTSD. I think this is a little bit of a stereotype, but there are a lot of veterans who have PTSD because this is a mental illness that is characterized by the reliving of unwanted traumatic memories and also associated panic attacks and mood disruptions that go along with that. And we're going to see here in a second when we look at this video that I have, which focuses on veterans with PTSD, that it is a debilitating condition that really disrupts people's lives. I also want to, looks like some folks are having some issues with getting kicked out. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why some folks keep having to log back in, and it's not your fault, I know, but it looks like a few people are having an issue with that right now. But anyway, PTSD is not just a mental illness that affects veterans. It can affect anyone who's been through a really traumatic experience. We think about it most often with veterans, but there are all sorts of traumatic experiences that can lead to developing post-traumatic stress disorder. I had a student a couple of years back who had PTSD caused by a car accident. And the particular circumstances of the car accident were such that this young man was driving his car and he made a mistake while driving. I don't remember exactly I don't remember the full story of what exactly happened, but this young man made a mistake while he was driving, and this mistake led to a car accident, which was his fault, and his wife ended up getting killed in the car accident. She was in the car with him, and she died as a result of the car accident, and he survived. And it was a very violent car accident, and she died very suddenly and violently, and it was an extremely traumatic experience for him. And he kept on reliving it over and over again. And particularly because the car accident was his fault, he had this immense amount of survivor's guilt that went along with that experience. And that's a feature that you will often observe among many folks who have PTSD, is survivor's guilt as well. Other times you see folks develop PTSD after having gone through a sexual assault. So there are all sorts of experiences, but the common denominator is that there's an extremely traumatic experience or set of experiences that lead the person to relive these memories over and over again. Michelle says, I was diagnosed with PTSD a few years ago. My house was broken into and I was held at gunpoint. It's been hard to live with, but possible. Wow, I am so sorry that happened to you. That's absolutely terrifying, because that's actually one of my worst fears. I'm one of these people that compulsively locks my doors. Because I live next to a busy road, Olive Road, and we get a lot of homeless people that walk up and down Olive Road. And, sometimes I have this paranoia about someone trying to break into our house because we live right there on the busy road. And sometimes I thought maybe I should get a security system installed in my house. And that makes me think that maybe I should. But I'm glad you survived that situation. That sounds absolutely terrible. So 7% of the population suffers from PTSD. Caleb says, I live on Palafox near Burgess. I completely understand. Michelle says, if it makes you feel better, it was a targeted thing. My sister was into bad people and had people looking for her. Well, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of home invasions are caused by a situation where the people perpetrating the home invasion believe that there's some reason to break into the home, like some like they are under the belief that there's something in that home that makes it worth their while breaking into that house. So I'm sorry that your sister caused that. I hope that she's turned her life around at this point, and hopefully that was a wake-up call for her, because clearly she put her and her loved ones' lives at risk by living that way. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video on PTSD, and I'm going to pause the recording at this point so I don't get any copyright violations. If you're watching the recording of the class meeting, shoot me an email as always, and I'll be glad to send you a link to the video that I'm about to play. So that video is a pretty, and there's a lot of emotion there, but it's a very informative look at what PTSD is all about. And I want to reiterate that it isn't just veterans who experience PTSD, people from all walks of life, anybody who's been through a really traumatic experience can face PTSD. And we should see the slides back up here. Let me know if that's not the case. So we have 7% of the population suffering from these symptoms. So it's the reliving of the traumatic memory, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, mood disruptions, nightmares. There's often a lot of mood issues and emotional lability. When we say someone is emotionally labile, that means that their emotional state is kind of all over the place, in a short period of time. And the good news is that we do have some helpful therapies like you saw in the video, and there are some medications out there. But the bad news, if you want to call it bad news, is that we don't really have a total cure for PTSD. We have therapies and medications that are helpful, that help people manage it. One controversial area is the idea of memory removal, right? So in a previous chapter, the chapter on memory, we saw the TED Talk by Elizabeth Loftus, where she talked about how false memories can be implanted into people's minds. There's an emerging area of research. It's kind of cutting edge, and again, this is kind of, it's not really there yet, but there are some folks who believe that eventually we will be able to develop the ability to target specific memories in the brain and erase them through various forms of neurosurgery and medications and that sort of thing. And there are a lot of folks who are experts in the field who believe that eventually one day we will develop the ability to target memories for erasure, kind of like in the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but kind of that idea, right? And the question comes up, if you suffered from PTSD and you could have those traumatic memories removed so that you no longer suffered from those memories, would you want to do that, right? I mean, that, on the one hand, to relieve yourself of the suffering, I can see how some folks would say, yeah, sign me up. But other folks I've heard say, no, thank you, right? Even though it causes me suffering, it's part of who I am, right? Our sense of identity is largely the result of our memories. And, who are we if we don't have our memories, right? So that's kind of an ethical, philosophical issue that I think is going to come up in the future once that technology finally does get fully developed. And I fully expect that we will see that technology come into existence eventually. The other disorder that's listed on this slide that I want to briefly mention, earlier I kind of referred to it as PTSD light, which is a little bit of an oversimplification, but an adjustment disorder is a psychological disorder caused by going through a stressful event that you're having trouble adjusting to, hence adjustment disorder. So for example, I knew someone once who was going through a divorce, and he was experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of mood issues and a lot of anxiety and a lot of disruption to his mental health caused by the stress of going through a divorce. And by the way, going through a divorce is one of the more stressful events that you can go through in life. But he was really having a lot of trouble adjusting to his new life as a single person, and also going through the stresses of the process of the divorce itself. And he was in psychotherapy, and he was diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. So, if someone's going through a divorce, or if they've lost a loved one, or, maybe experienced the death of a child or something like that, and you're having trouble adjusting to that problem, chances are you're probably going to get diagnosed with an adjustment disorder, not PTSD, because PTSD is more reserved for folks who go through a more extreme sort of life-threatening, traumatic sort of event, like a sexual assault, or like being held at gunpoint, or like going through combat, or a car accident where the other passenger dies, right? All those sorts of events. But an adjustment disorder is more related to the stress of going through just the things that happen in life, right? A lot of people go through a divorce. A lot of people experience the death of loved ones. A lot of people, unfortunately, experience the death of one of their children, right? So these aren't life-threatening events, but they're extremely stressful nonetheless, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the reason why I refer to adjustment disorders as kind of PTSD-like, because it's related to going through stressful events or a stressful event, but the stressful event is not life-threatening or traumatic to the same level of severity that you would see with the sort of event that would bring on PTSD, if that makes sense. Any comments about PTSD or adjustment disorder before we move on and talk about mood disorders for a little bit? All right, so I want to talk a little bit now about mood disorders. And the two major mood disorders that I'm going to talk about are depression and bipolar disorder. So there are basically two types of depression diagnoses that you can receive in the DSM-5. One is major depressive disorder, and the other is persistent depressive disorder. So I want to talk about those two a little bit. Major depressive disorder is sometimes referred to as the common cold of mental illness. And I kind of have mixed feelings about it being referred to like that, because on the one hand, it really does capture just how frequent major depressive disorder, usually just referred to as depression, but how common depression actually is. In fact, 15% of the population will go through at least one major depressive episode at some point in their life. And I'm going to pull out my calculator here and do the math. Let's see. We have 33 people in this class, I believe. So 5 people, 5 of you minimum, at some point in your life, if you have not already, will experience a major depressive episode. So this is something that many of you could probably relate to or will relate to at some point in your life, unfortunately. And I must confess, this is something I can tell you that that although it's commonly referred to as the common cold of mental illness, it can be debilitating. And I'm having a little bit of instability in my internet connection. Are you guys still with me? Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because if I get cut off, you know what happened. But I got a notification on my screen a second ago from Zoom that said my internet connection is unstable. So if I get cut off, you'll know why. So depression is something that I've experienced and battled with, and I'm happy to say that I've figured out what works for me, what what keeps depression away for me, and it's different for everyone. But for me, it is largely involved. It involves staying physically active, maintaining a meditation practice, having a good group of friends, and eating well. And there have been times in my life where I've had to utilize medication to relieve a depressive disorder. I was on Prozac for a number of years, and I'm not on Prozac anymore, but there is nothing wrong with resorting to medication if you need to. And I don't think that people should be shamed for that. So I'm very open about my own experiences with depression, because I want you guys to feel less stigmatized when you go through it yourself, right? Because statistically, we know at least 5 people in this class, 5 of you students minimum, will experience or already have experienced symptoms of major depression in your life. So I like the fact that we refer to it as the common cold of mental illnesses, in the sense that it conveys just how common it is. It's one of the most common mental illnesses, if not the most common. However, the reason I don't like referring it to that is because by referring to it as the common cold of mental illness, it kind of falsely conveys that it's kind of harmless, right? And if there's anybody in here who has ever gone through a major depressive episode, you can attest to the fact that it is not harmless. It can be a life-threatening sort of situation to be in when you're in the midst of it, because it totally distorts your perceptions of reality. Everything becomes tasteless, and you can't experience any pleasure. And when I was at my worst, I could barely get out of bed. And many people who experience depression attempt suicide, and unfortunately, many people complete their suicide attempts. So it can be fatal. Caleb says, my major depressive disorder happened between the age of 15 and 18. I came out as gay at 16 and subsequently attempted suicide 6 separate times before the age of 18. And I'm so sorry you went through that, but I'm glad you're still with us. I laid in bed for weeks. I didn't shower. I didn't have any hygienic practices. It was rock bottom for me. Yeah, and that sounds about right. I don't mean right as in good, but that is those are the sorts of descriptions that you will hear. Folks can't get out of bed. They literally don't have the energy to lift themselves out of bed. And actually, when you're at your lowest point, where you don't even have the energy to get out of bed or take a shower or eat, this is where your life really starts to fall apart. And as you start to get a little bit of your energy back, for example, if someone starts antidepressants, the first few weeks that they start the antidepressants, often they'll start to get their energy back a little bit, but the depression hasn't completely gone away, because it takes a few weeks for most antidepressants to fully kick in. So it's those first few weeks that you're on antidepressants that people really need to monitor you, or keep an eye on you, because you're starting to get a little bit of energy back, but a lot of depression is still there. So this is the time actually when a lot of folks will actually attempt suicide, because they're actually starting to get a little bit of their energy and motivation back. So they actually have the energy and motivation to actually try to do it, right? So those first few weeks on antidepressants, as they're starting to work but haven't fully kicked in, those are often a really dangerous time for a lot of folks. And if you know anyone who is just starting antidepressants, this is a time particularly when you really need to keep an eye on them and be there for them, because of what I just described. So this can be a life-threatening condition. And even though it's extremely common, it can be life-threatening. And even if it's not life-threatening, even if you don't end up attempting suicide, it can wreck your life. It can mess up your social relationships, your romantic relationships. It can cause people to lose jobs because they just don't have the energy to get out of bed and go into work. And it's a real vortex of just sorrow and nothingness and grayness. And I just, if you've been through it, you know what I'm talking about. The good news, though, is that we have a lot of effective treatments for depression. I can attest from my own experiences that there are some medications out there that can be really helpful. The interesting thing and kind of the frustrating thing about antidepressant medication is that it's kind of trial and error. So, a medication that helps one person might make another person worse, right? And there are literally a dozen or more different types of antidepressants that you can try. And and it can take some time, unfortunately, to find the one that works for you and helps you. But I would say that the evidence suggests that the most effective treatment for depression involves a combination of psychotherapy and antidepressant medication, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you combine cognitive behavioral therapy with antidepressant medication, that's going to be your best bet for an effective treatment. And if those things don't work, there are some more extreme treatments that you can try sort of as a last resort, like electroshock therapy, which is known as electroconvulsive therapy, which is kind of a last resort kind of treatment, but it's actually really helpful for a lot of folks, believe it or not. We'll talk about more about those treatments in the last chapter. And Caleb, by the way, thank you for sharing your experiences with that. I think it's important that students know that they're not alone going through these things, and we need to work to get rid of the stigma associated with mental illness. So I always applaud people opening up and being candid about their own experiences. Yeah, I understand. I understand. I hope I haven't triggered you in any way talking about it. I apologize if I have. Didn't mean to. I'm here if you want to talk later. Okay, so the next form of depression that you don't hear as much about, but is sort of this is a milder version of depression, but is longer lasting. So persistent depressive disorder is a DSM-5 diagnosis that describes a depressive episode that lasts for at least 2 years. So most depressive episodes last, months, particularly if you start to get treatment. But in the case of persistent depressive disorder, oh, here's my doggy. You want to come up? He wants to say hi. With persistent depressive disorder, we're talking about a depressive state that lasts up to 2 years, but it's relatively more mild. And the good news about this, of course, yeah, isn't she knows she's adorable too. She's a diva. She was giving me a hell of a time yesterday in class when I was teaching my Monday and Wednesday section because the plumber was here. So I had to keep her in the office with me to keep her from bothering the plumber because we were having a plumbing emergency. And she was just going nuts trying to get to the plumber. And I actually had to end my class meeting early yesterday because she was being a little bit of a diva. So she's being better today. She is so cute though. So this is a more mild version of depression that lasts a much longer period of time. So it's harder to treat. It's a little more resistant because it's persistent, but the symptoms are also more mild. So that's the good news about it. Can't play right now. If you're going to be chill, then we can hang out. But if you're going to start biting my shirt, then I'm going to have to kick you out and shut the door. Stop. Your mommy's calling you. All right. She went to go hang out with her mommy. Okay. Thank you. So, so that's persistent depressive disorder, and it's a lot less common, 2 to 3% of the population, to be exact. I want to talk a little bit about the gender differences in depression rates. Now, this is a controversial topic because some folks argue that women aren't actually, no worries, Casey. It happens. Oh, you're back. You're back. Women are actually, don't bite my shirt. It's not playtime. I'm giving you a lecture. Women are much more likely, I'm going to have to kick you out. No, she's good. I'm just going to have to shut the door. It's all good. Sorry about that. Okay, so there is a gender. Uh, she brightened the mood for this depressing ass chapter. Fair enough that she did. Uh, there is a gender difference in rates of depression diagnosis. So women are diagnosed with depression, major depressive disorder to be precise, at twice the rate of men. And folks like to argue about what's really happening here. So some folks say that women actually do get depressed more often than men do. Now, as someone who struggled with depression myself, I'm a guy. I don't know how true that is, but one idea is that women actually experience depression more often because maybe women have a greater tendency to internalize stress, and men have a greater tendency to externalize stress, meaning acting out, aggressively, maybe getting involved in substance abuse, that sort of thing. That's one theory. Another theory, which is the one that I think I'm a little bit more partial to. I'm curious what you guys think. Another theory is that men are just less likely to seek help than women. That men actually get depressed just as often as women do, but because we're socialized to believe that men should just grin and bear it, so to speak, and not show any weakness, that men just suffer in silence. And I think some evidence to support this is the fact that men actually commit suicide at a much greater frequency than women do. So the suicide rate of completed suicides is much higher among men, right? So that leads me to believe that perhaps men are experiencing depression just as often as women are, but just are not seeking help. What do you guys think? Do you think that women really do get depressed more often than men do? Or do you think it's just that men are being socialized to be macho and therefore just don't seek help when they need it? Gene agrees with me. Any other thoughts on that? We'll move on.
I definitely agree, but I do have a handful of male friends that have like been outwardly expressive about it, but I'm thinking it's just because like they're more comfortable with me like sharing their feelings because I'm a woman, you know? Whereas like I can't speak for how they are around their guy friends, but yeah, I just know they're more expressive towards me about it. And I know they make jokes about it, and like whenever I was in high school, they made jokes in class all the time about them having depression. So I don't know if it's like definitely true, but I've witnessed like them being vocal about it plenty of times.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. And Aubrey makes a fine point too, that there could be some truth to both arguments. It could be that maybe women are slightly more predisposed to depression, but also men are discouraged from seeking help. And those two things could converge to produce the differences in diagnosis that we see. Caleb says, uh, I think it used to be stigmatized, but with my generation, it's more common to be expressive about it. In older generations, it was more stigmatized. Yeah. And I think we can thank a lot of the efforts that have been made to destigmatize it to organizations like Active Minds, for example, which I'm involved with, which is a club dedicated to destigmatizing the seeking of help and reducing suicide rates. Active Minds was founded by a college student back in the early 2000s who, this was a young lady whose brother, her younger brother committed suicide when he started college, and nobody had any idea that he was going through depression at all. He hid it from everyone. And then after he passed away, they unearthed some of his journals and found out that he was really going through hell, and no one had any idea because he was putting on this public face of toughness. So we can thank organizations like Active Minds and others, I think, for at least to some degree reducing some of that stigma. Stigma is deadly. Uh, So let's see here. Bipolar disorder is the other mood disorder that I want to talk a little bit about today. And hopefully we have time to make it to schizophrenia. So bipolar disorder is characterized by the presence of what are called manic episodes. So manic episodes are the defining feature of bipolar disorder. And if anyone in here has ever experienced a manic episode and I mischaracterize it, feel free to correct me if you feel safe opening up about it. I don't have bipolar disorder myself, so if I'm mischaracterizing the manic episode, please correct me. But my understanding of the manic episode is that it is a mood state that a person gets into where they become very impulsive and have a lot of grandiosity, a lot of big ideas come into their heads that seem like really good ideas at the time, but looking back on it, you know, if they act on these impulses, they later regret it, right? So, for example, I have an acquaintance. I have an acquaintance who is a local artist who suffers from bipolar disorder. And it's kind of a catch-22 for him because he creates some of his most creative art when he's having a manic episode. But also, he tends to do really regrettable things while he's having a manic episode. So, for example, one time while he was having a manic episode, he went and cheated on his wife, which led to his marriage ending. A marriage of 8 years, you know, came to an end because he impulsively acted on this. A lot of times when people are manic, they become very hypersexual, which is a common symptom of mania. Another time he had a manic episode and he got this big idea about starting a small business, which was completely not thought through in any way whatsoever. It was totally a harebrained idea, but he managed, I don't know how the hell he managed to do this, but he managed to convince a bank to give him this huge $50,000 loan so he could go start this small business, which he did not think through whatsoever. And he took this giant loan with a pretty hefty interest rate. And he went and attempted to start this small business, and the business was belly up within 3 months because it was totally ill planned. And now he's stuck paying off this loan for the rest of his life, or he's going to eventually have to declare bankruptcy to absolve the debt, right? So this guy is a very talented artist, and he makes some of his best art when he's having a manic episode. And the problem that he deals with is that when he goes on medication to prevent his manic episodes, it makes his creativity go away, right? So some, you know, there have been times when he's gone on lithium to treat his manic episodes, and it's very effective. The lithium stops his manic episodes, and he becomes very even-minded and, you know, the model of mental health once he's on his lithium. The problem is, though, he says that he can't make art while he's on lithium. He just completely loses his creative motivation 100%. It just goes away, right? So that's the catch-22. And I've heard a number of people with bipolar disorder kind of describe similar experiences. It's really strange. And I don't mean to stereotype artists too much because this is already kind of a stereotype of artists. But it is true that bipolar disorder tends to be overrepresented among artists. And we don't exactly know why that is, but a number of famous artists who it appears have had bipolar disorder, and I'll show you some of them in the next slide. But I want you guys to be familiar with the two basic types of bipolar disorder. These are the two most common types. There are some other types like rapid cycling and some other types of bipolar disorder that are a little less common, but do exist. But the two most common types of bipolar disorder are bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. So bipolar 1 is just pure occasional manic episodes, right? So you have periods of relatively normal mood, which cycle with periods of full-blown mania. That's bipolar 1. So you have full-blown manic episodes alternated with relatively normal mood states. Bipolar 2 disorder characterized by cycling between um, relatively mild manic states. So mild manic states are what's known as hypomania, HYPO, hypomanic states, which are kind of they're manic episodes, but they're not as intense as a full-blown manic episode. So people with bipolar 2 disorder, they cycle between episodes of hypomania, which is mild mania, and episodes of full-blown major depression, right? So they go back and forth between mild mania and severe depression. So those are the basic major two types of bipolar disorder. Does anyone in here know anyone who has bipolar disorder, and what are they like? What sort of symptoms do they display? Anybody have any perspectives on this? So I did mention that that bipolar disorder seems to be overrepresented among creative types, and we're not exactly sure why this is, but there's some evidence that this is the case. So some very famous artists that we now believe had bipolar disorder historically by just looking at their work and some of their journals and testimony of people who knew them. The artist Michelangelo, who he did the Sistine Chapel, right? Vincent van Gogh, who we actually have one of his paintings on the side of our psychology building, building 14 on campus, The Starry Night, which is a famous Van Gogh painting. He is believed to have suffered from bipolar disorder, and famously, he was known to have most famously cut one of his ears off, and he gave an ear of his as a gift to someone that he knew. I forget if it was a love interest or a cousin of his, but Van Gogh cut his ear off and presented it as a gift to someone while he was in a manic state. Dylan says, my ex-girlfriend's mother is bipolar. She is a very happy person, but when she drinks, she is easy to set off. Then when she has an episode, she then leads to a month of depression. Yeah, that sounds about right. Georgia O'Keeffe, the artist, Ernest Hemingway, the famous writer, he was believed to have had bipolar disorder, and he actually died by suicide. Van Gogh died by suicide as well. And kind of interesting about Van Gogh, when he took his life, he shot himself, but I don't know if he just what caused this, but when he shot himself, he didn't die immediately, and it actually took him a couple of days to die from his gunshot wound. So he actually had a couple of days to sit around and talk to people and tell them why he had taken his own life, but before the infection set in, and he finally died of his wound. So that's an interesting kind of sad story. Ernest Hemingway was believed, like I said, to have had bipolar disorder, and he took his own life during a period of depression in which he was suffering from writer's block. And to oversimplify a little bit, but the basics of the story is that Ernest Hemingway took his own life because he had writer's block, right? And he was depressed over the fact that he had writer's block. So those are those are some relatively famous cases of folks we believe to have had bipolar disorder. So in terms of incidence, about 3 to 4% of the population suffers from bipolar disorder, or at least will experience symptoms of bipolar disorder at some point in their lifetimes. And interestingly, there's some overlap between bipolar disorder and the next disorder that I'm going to talk about, schizophrenia. Both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are highly heritable, meaning that they tend to run in families. So if you have a close relative, a parent or a sibling who has bipolar disorder or who has schizophrenia, then you are much more likely to develop the disorder yourself. It seems to be one of those mental illnesses that is highly influenced by genetics. and it most commonly emerges during late adolescence or early adulthood, also a feature of schizophrenia. So two things that bipolar disorder and schizophrenia share in common are that uh, they are highly heritable, and they both tend to emerge when you're young, during late adolescence or early adulthood. There's also some other overlap in the fact that you can also become psychotic when you have a full-blown manic episode. It doesn't always happen, but in some cases, folks who have full-blown manic episodes can become psychotic, meaning that they become disconnected from reality in some way. They might suffer delusions or even hallucinations at some point if you're having a full-blown hardcore manic episode. So Michelle said, I just found out that my grandmother's mom had it and was institutionalized her whole life. My grandfather's sister raised him because of this. Yeah, that's intense. And the treatment back then wasn't as good as it is now. So, and I can relate to some degree because the next disorder that I'm going to talk about, schizophrenia, and that's a good segue, actually, is that I have a grandparent myself who suffered from schizophrenia. It was actually not a grandparent. It was my great grandmother's brother, right? So so somewhat removed, not a close genetic relative, but my great grandmother's brother had schizophrenia. Oh, you were talking about schizophrenia, not bipolar disorder. Yeah, so that's a good segue. Yeah, so my great grandmother's brother had schizophrenia, and he died back in the 1970s before I was born, but he lived in the day and age of lobotomies, and so my great uncle, who I'm describing, he was one of the folks who underwent lobotomy as a treatment for schizophrenia, which is no longer a treatment anymore, but it involved basically cutting the part of the frontal lobe out. Very kind of barbaric procedure by modern standards. And he was lobotomized. And I wouldn't be surprised if your great grandmother, Michelle, was lobotomized as well, because that was the common treatment for schizophrenia back in the day before we had the medications that we have now. So we have 15 minutes left to talk about schizophrenia, which is about right. So there are some overlaps, like I said, between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. With that said, schizophrenia is definitely a more serious mental illness. They're both serious mental illnesses, but if depression is the common cold of mental illnesses, then you might think of schizophrenia as the cancer of mental illnesses, an extremely debilitating mental illness that unfortunately, as was the case with my great uncle and Michelle's great grandmother, many folks with schizophrenia have to be institutionalized for years and years of their lives and have to take heavily sedating medications their entire lives in order to manage the symptoms. So schizophrenia, the word schizo means split. And this is based upon the idea that there's a split between thought and emotion. And people often mistakenly think that schizophrenia is multiple personality disorder. But that's not the case. Multiple personality disorder, we'll get to next time, is what's known as a dissociative disorder. So people commonly confuse multiple personality disorder with schizophrenia. They're different things. With schizophrenia, there's a disconnect between thoughts and feelings, and also there's a disconnect between the mind and reality. So you have disruptions of emotion, you have disruptions of perception, and it's not so common. It's less than 1% of the population, and men and women equally. Also, Caleb's great aunt had schizophrenia as well. So less than 1% of the population will be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and there are no gender differences in the prevalence. So with schizophrenia, we see a cluster of symptoms that involve basically a disconnect with reality. And the symptoms of schizophrenia, like I said, involve motor disruptions, cognitive disruptions, behavioral disruptions, perceptual abnormalities, delusions, and you've got delusional thinking, you've got hallucinations, and these disturbances happen for at least 6 months before you can get diagnosed. All right. So let's take a look at a video that I have for you guys on schizophrenia. And we have a little bit of time left. Let me actually look and see how long. I might have to save this video for next time. Let's see. Yeah, the video is 10 minutes long. I don't want to rush the schizophrenia conversation. So let's actually, let's table schizophrenia and talk more about schizophrenia on Tuesday. And I've got a video that I'm going to play for you guys on the topic. Oh, the TED Talk that Jordan Smith mentioned to me. Oh, you sent this to me as a private text, but Jordan Smith says that there's a TED Talk about a woman with schizophrenia where she talked about her experiences. Yeah, I think I know the TED Talk that you're talking about, Jordan. It's about a law professor who has schizophrenia, if I remember correctly. Really good TED Talk, actually. But next time, we're going to watch some actual footage of some real patients with schizophrenia, and we'll talk more about the symptoms of schizophrenia. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys out 10 minutes early today because I feel like if I jump further into schizophrenia right now, then I'm going to run out of time, and I'm not going to be able to fully talk about it the way that I want to. So we'll stop here, and we'll continue with schizophrenia next time. That'll be it for today. Don't forget about your paper that's due tonight. Don't forget to sign in if you have not already done so. And I will see you guys on Tuesday. See you guys on Tuesday. Stay safe and healthy.